Whenever I'm asked what my favorite Bible verse is, I like to answer with one that's not so well known or expected. And one of those lesser known verses I sometimes claim as my favorite is Ecclesiastes 7:10. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. I suspect this verse resonates so much with me because I know my own inclination to romanticize the past. The older I get, the more I've come to recognize the emotional power of nostalgia. I can stumble across an old home videotape, or hear the theme song of a 90s sitcom, or play a Nintendo 64 game that I loved as a kid, and suddenly my heart can be filled with a longing for the past, when life was simpler, the quote-unquote good old days. On a cultural level, we might look back to the days when Ronald Reagan was president, or when television was wholesome, when girls were girls and men were men, as the old song goes. Those were the days. On a personal level, maybe we look back to the days when we were in college, or newly married, or when our kids were still kids, and we find ourselves tempted to ask the very question Ecclesiastes is telling us not to ask. Why were the former days better than these? If you're a fan of The Office, you might remember when Andy Bernard said, "I wish there was a way to know you're in the good old days before you've actually left them." But the curious thing about nostalgia is that it only seems to remember the good things about the past, when in reality, the past had its downsides too. We had problems and difficulties back then just like we do now, yet somehow nostalgia has a way of minimizing the bad in favor of the good, leaving us with unrealistic sentiments about what the past was really like. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why the writer of Ecclesiastes warns us about falling into a good old days mentality. But the goal then is not to minimize or forget about the goodness of the past. Because the truth is, I should be able to recognize that God has been very good to me. His goodness and mercy have been following me all the days of my life. But for some reason, it's often so much easier to see His goodness from the vantage point of hindsight rather than in the here and now of the present. Our present lives typically feel boring and uneventful, but in reality, God is just as much at work in our lives today as He's ever been. The Bible says in Lamentations 3, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning." The problem with a good old days mentality is that it often causes us to overlook the new goodness and mercy that God is pouring into our lives today. Psalm 118 says, "This is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it." Every day, God is making a day that He's never made before. One in which you and I have the privilege of living and experiencing His never-ending mercies. And chances are these are days you'll wish you could return to whenever you look back on them years from now. So think of them as brand new good old days.